Now at this point here, it's not super obvious what the real difference between constants and variables is, because we're basically using this constant as we're using these variables. But the key difference is that variables can be reassigned. We could, for example, set investment amount to 2000 here, so that it's 1000 initially, and then later in our program, we set it to 2000. Now, of course, in this program, that doesn't make too much sense though. We could have just set it to 2000 right away here. But this will make sense in other programs where values can indeed change. For example, here in this program, once we start fetching user input. So let's now finally make this program a bit more helpful by also fetching user input. To be precise, I want to allow users of this application to enter their own values for the investment amount, for the number of years, and the expected return rate. Now, thankfully in Go, getting a value from a user is pretty straightforward because this FMT package, which we're already importing, does actually not just provide us functions for outputting something to the terminal, but also functions to get input from the terminal, so to allow the user to enter values into the terminal. And the function we can use for that is the scan function, so that we scan the terminal for input, you could say. Now, the scan function works such that we have to pass one or more, I'll get back to this notation later in the course, one or more variables, you could say, to scan, and scan will then populate those variables with data entered by the user. Scan then actually also produces some values we could use, but we can ignore them for now. We did see a function that produces a value in the past already. The power function provided by the math package produced the result of taking this value to the power of this value, and we used that result in our calculation. Here for scan, we're not interested in the result of calling that function. Instead, we just have to pass a variable to it so that it's populated with some value. So for example, if we want to get the investment amount, we could pass the investment amount variable to scan. However, if we would do it like this, it actually wouldn't work. Instead, you need to pass a so-called pointer to this variable to scan, and you do that by adding the ampersand symbol in front of that variable name. So this symbol here, it must be added in front of this variable name. Now, pointers are a super important topic in Go, but they're also a bit of a more advanced topic, which is why we'll explore them in depth later in the course. For the moment, you just need to know that you need to pass such a pointer to scan and that you create one by adding this ampersand symbol in front of that variable. That then allows scan to populate that variable with a value, and therefore, after executing this line of code, investment amount will be whichever value we entered into the terminal. So we can therefore save that code, open that terminal again, and again run our application. And as you'll see, the application now seems to get stuck. We don't get a response, we don't get any output here. And it's getting stuck because of this line of code. This now waits for some user input, and that's why the application got stuck down there. Indeed, we now have to enter a value here, for example, 2000. And if you then hit enter, the application will continue, and now the future and the real value will be based on that investment amount. And that's how easy it is to fetch user input. And here you now also see the idea behind using variables. This investment amount variable here has an initial value, but this value then gets overwritten by whatever the user enters here. Therefore, since we always fetch input from the user here, we can of course also get rid of that initial value, which you can do when using the var keyword and declaring a variable like this. Now we just declare the variable, so we just make Go aware of the fact that this variable exists, but we don't assign an initial value. We don't define the variable as it's called. Instead, we wait for that user input so that we then have a value for that variable. And this now, for example, would not work with a constant. If I would try to pass inflation rate here, I would get an error that this is an invalid operation, basically because it's a constant. And constants can only be set once and can never change thereafter, no matter if you assign an initial value or not. And indeed, with constants, you have to assign an initial value since they can never be changed. Therefore, they always need an initial value. Variables, on the other hand, don't. And that's why variables are an important concept in Go, but actually in programming in general, no matter which language you're using.